Hello, everybody, and don't worry, your regularly scheduled sci-fi fantasy for content will be returning very soon. I just wanted to take today to address a recent resurgence in comments around my dyslexia, some positive, some negative, some flat out attacking, that have come up in the community recently. And I'll break this video down into 3 parts. The first one is addressing those comments. 2 is kind of my story of how I came to grow and improve as a reader, as someone who suffers from dyslexia. And 3, actual advice for my fellow dyslexics out there, because this actually is true. Dyslexia is actually the most commonly diagnosed disability. It is very prevalent, and I just want to help people who may be suffering in a way that I once was as a kid, because I was severely dyslexic to the point where I was pulled out of school and put in special therapy for years. I had all kinds of just different exercises drilled into me, but we'll get into that in a minute. First, I want to talk about some comments that have happened. Some just genuinely curious, some saying that I shouldn't be a book critic because I'm dyslexic, and others that are just flat out insulting. To the first batch of questions, most of them are targeted around the fact of like, hey, how did you get to the point where you're able to be a book reviewer when in their interpretation of dyslexia, I should be a slower reader than just about anyone else? And to answer that, I'm not that slow of a reader anymore. In fact, I'd say I'm faster than a lot because I read as like basically an exercise. This is a muscle, and I have to work extra hard to keep my reading abilities at the same plane as most people. So I kind of drastically overcompensate and take it higher than most because it's an insecurity, and overcompensation is my method of taking care of that. This is basically why I got into reading sci-fi and fantasy when I was a kid, because I felt very insecure about my disability, and so I overcompensated. I did too much, and that's just stuck with me. Now it's a career. Hey, and the next most common question I get from these type of people is regarding like, hey, I'm dyslexic too. How do I get to the point where I'm able to read like you? And that one I'll answer in the last part of this video because it's a long and convoluted process. It's an important one, and it's one that I hope people who aren't even dyslexic look into, so maybe they could better understand some people they may know who have this problem as well, because surprise, surprise, statistically you know several, diagnosed or not. And now the second group of people, the people who kind of just say like, you can't be a book critic when you're dyslexic. Why are you doing this? This is wrong. Well, over 160,000 people disagree with you, but okay, dyslexia doesn't make it so that I process a storyline, a character arc, or anything along those lines any differently than anyone else. I'm not somehow reading a different book than you. It just means you're walking a beaten path, something that's like, oh, I'm reading this book and it's just down this journey. Well, I'm kind of having to do a little bit of an obstacle course. But even now, I'm so good at that obstacle course, I'm probably moving down the path the same level as you. And that's not because I'm smarter or better than anyone, it's because I devote drastically more of my life to being a fast and efficient reader than many others. I have to work harder for this, and I'm not going to stop because I really love my job. And then there's just the people who go to the videos where I mention I'm dyslexic. They go to videos where I'm reading out loud from news articles, and they'll just insult me, whether they know I'm dyslexic or not. From other videos, they'll just say like, wow, this guy can't even read, and yet he has the gall or the audacity, or I've seen so many words used, calling me idiot, stupid, I've seen the R word several times. And just, guys, I take my biggest insecurity, which is my dyslexia, and I broadcast it unfiltered on the channel because I want to show people that, hey, it's not that big a deal. Just because, yes, reading out loud for dyslexics is like the hardest thing because there's extra pressure, and I'm doing it in front of tens of thousands of people. So I'm aware that's going to be me at my worst display. If my dyslexia is the most flared up, it's the most intense because reading out loud to people is where like your anxiety and pressure just exacerbate the problem. I don't want to stop doing that though, because I've seen other dyslexics look at that and say that's so encouraging to see that I'm not embarrassed when I flub a line. I'm not going to edit them out. I'm not going to retake it because, hey, look, It's just a part of who I am, and I don't want to frame it as this thing that needs to be hidden. No, dyslexia is fine. It just means I think and process information different than you. And a side effect of that is I also struggle a bit reading out loud still, even though when I'm not reading out loud, I can fly through pages. Reading out loud kind of takes me back to when I'm like in 6th grade and Mrs. Price asked me to read in front of the class. Also, Mrs. Price, the fact that you made me do that a lot, I hated you at the time, but now I get you were trying to help me and I appreciate you. But I'm not going to stop doing that. I'm aware I'm going to continue to get crappy comments about it, but it's an important thing for me. It's like my own form of representation for fellow dyslexics out there. I want to show them that you can do it. You can get up and give a speech like I did in college. I have a degree that forced me to get up and give speeches again and again and again because I wanted to overcome the problem. And I'm still going to screw up, but I'm a pretty decent rhetorician. But let's get into the final chunk of this video, and one that I think is probably the most important, and that's exactly what therapies did I go through and do I still do to this day, and how can you as a dyslexic or someone who knows a dyslexic help the situation. And notice I didn't say problem, because I don't think it's a problem. Dyslexia is not a problem, it's a difference. Well, the first thing I did was start overcompensating, which obviously still happens. This is something that you'll see a lot of dyslexics doing. In fact, one of the most common things I see when I talk about the fact that the reason I got into reading so much sci-fi and fantasy is because I was trying to overcompensate for my dyslexia is a whole lot of other dyslexics saying, me too. It seems to be, I don't know why, a very common solution to the problem is to try and just force yourself to read a bunch more. I think this is because psychologically dyslexics know there's no avoiding reading. It's one of the most universal things in the world. So what they do is they try and just make it so it becomes a massive part of their day, and so they can try and upgrade their abilities by just going that route, which I want to say is a very good start. But you have to understand as a dyslexic that you will have some diminishing returns pushing yourself to just extremes, because your brain's a muscle and you can overwork it. So you want to work smart, not hard. One, you do need to read a lot. I don't discourage you from doing that at all, but include different methods that will help you learn to read faster and process information more efficiently. The first therapy that really worked for me a lot was called chunking. And what this is you take 2 note cards or even just one with a slit cut out in the middle, and you minimize what on the page your eyes are trying to process. And so you'll just take the line you're looking at. And this helps tremendously. This is huge, and I cannot stress enough is something dyslexics should try out, because I had a lot of different therapists offer different solutions in school, but once I had a private therapist who really knew what she was talking about, this was the method she brought to me, and it was extraordinary how much I saw an improvement, because this doesn't just make you read faster while you're chunking, but it better trains your brain in the long run to block out what's not important on the page and focus your dyslexia on just trying to process the information that is currently in front of you. So that's the number one thing for reading. But I also want to just kind of really hammer in that dyslexics should not focus on speed reading for a long time. You need to just hammer in the basics, retrain your brain fundamentally like I did for years, so that you just have a rock solid foundation to grow on and improve from. It's kind of like that you need to walk before you run thing. You can't be a dyslexic speed reader if you haven't just learned to be a proficient dyslexic reader. I also encourage dyslexics, I know this is probably the most embarrassing part of being dyslexic and one that people are really afraid of, to read out loud as much as possible. This will be frustrating. Hell, being a dyslexic in general is very frustrating. You're constantly battling yourself, and as pretty much every human who's ever had to fight against themselves knows, that sucks. It really sucks to know you're screwing up as you're doing something that the second you do it wrong, you know you're wrong. So you need to give yourself a lot of leash. Be very forgiving with your own brain and appreciate your dyslexic brain. You're different than a lot of people and you process information in a unique way. That's a good thing. Appreciate that about yourself. Just know there's this one side effect and you really have to work with it. But read out loud, please. Give speeches, do these things. I found this too after I got through the humiliating period and I first started seeing myself improve. This was one of the biggest confidence boosters as a dyslexic reader I ever had. Let's get into the next huge hurdle for dyslexics. And this is spelling, right? Spelling is probably, for most dyslexics, I would confidently say, the more difficult area to progress than reading, because surprise, surprise, reading, your brain kind of autofills and corrects things as well, in a way where you're able to, even though you don't know how to spell that word on your own, process it for the word that it is. But when it comes to sitting down and just spelling a word, I remember specifically one word when I was, I think, 11 or 12, inherent. I spent like a day trying to get that word right, and like not straight for 8 hours, but we tried it in the morning. I got it down. I forgot. I had to relearn it in the afternoon. We got it down. I forgot. Like, that's how dyslexia works. It's awful. And so the therapy method for spelling like this that worked the best for me was take some form of granulated powder, something that's got a really good grit to it. Sand, salt, something along those lines, not flour. And as you're trying to learn to spell it, on a piece of paper where you have this powder of some sort, start tracing the letters. This tactile feedback, for some reason, really helps cement the spelling in. It's not a cheat. You're still going to struggle, but I found it to be, instead of having to repeat a word 40 times before my brain would, okay, this is how you spell it, and I'll remember it for 4 hours, then we'll try again. It was more like the 7 to 11 area, and that would be pretty consistent. So try that. That was really good for me, but I also need to say that this isn't all universal. Everyone, even dyslexics, learn differently, and experiment, try different forms of therapy, maybe develop your own. I know, especially for giving speeches, I developed a lot of cheats that are specific to me that I'm able to then grow off of and, make whole videos that I now have my career based off of for. That's how I've trained myself. And, dyslexics will all have their own versions to do things like this. Now, the next point, and this is kind of just miscellaneous as well, and this, okay, I love tech, don't get me wrong, but there are things in tech that make life more difficult while they seemingly make them easier for dyslexics. You're going to see a lot of people throw in your face that there's this dyslexic font that solves all problems. I've used that dyslexic font. It seems to maybe help a little bit. It's not a cure-all. There's no cure-all. People are going to throw that at you a lot like it's a cure-all because they hear of dyslexic font and they have the Gwyneth Paltrow version of science in their head and they think it's going to solve a problem. It doesn't. Don't listen to them. You're going to need to work because that's how this functions. There's a few things you need to cut out of your life occasionally to then have days where you work harder, because those days, while they are frustrating, are very important. Turn off autocorrect everywhere. Not all the time, but for certain days. And this is because autocorrect for dyslexics is just a cop-out. And you are not going to improve, especially in spelling, if you aren't actually having to challenge yourself. And autocorrect is no, you don't need to. Now, granted, as a dyslexic, I'm very aware that us and all general people very often misspell things so bad that even autocorrect is like, dude, what the f***? That happens. There's the red squiggly line, and autocorrect's like, I got no idea. Dyslexics, I've seen this even in dyslexic friends I have, and I certainly am guilty of it too. You'll spell out a word how you think it's spelled, autocorrect fixes it, and you're like, okay. And then you just move on, and you don't take the time, and you're not going to, let's be honest, to sit down and write down that word as it's supposed to be spelled, and come back and take notes and train. You're not going to do that because autocorrect solved the problem. Just have 2 or 3 days a week where you turn it off on all your devices and note which words you're struggling with, write them down, and go through, do whatever therapies you develop for yourself to solve it. These are all things that I just really wanted to get out there in a video because I find being in a position where I am dyslexic, but it's my job to read for a living. It's a curious situation because there are people out there who hear that and they think that's awesome, and I agree with you. I'm very proud of myself. It's something I've really worked tens of thousands of hours for my whole life. And there's people who hear it and they use it as a way to condescend. These people are small peepee and I don't really care about them. I can't imagine what would cause someone to throw stones in that way. And then there's people who just have genuine questions who want to know more. And I hope I answered quite a few of those in this video. But please, if you're dyslexic, let me know in the comments down below what works for you. I'd love for this comment section to be a bit of a resource for other dyslexics to come to and say, all right, what is working for people? What can I try? Because I know there are therapies that have worked for other people that haven't worked for me. And I'm sure some of the stuff I just suggested here won't work for some people. But anyway, guys, thank you for liking and subscribing. I hope you're having a wonderful start to your week and have a good one, y'all. Peace.